As a small business owner, your to-do list is long. The Knot makes advertising easy and connects you with the right couples at the right time. Visit vendors.theknot.com/podcast for 15% off your first month with code podcast15.
Hello, and thank you for listening to the History of World War II podcast, episode 397, interview with Iain MacGregor about his book, The Lighthouse of Stalingrad. Publisher, historian, author, and public speaker Iain MacGregor has just released a history of the Battle of Stalingrad, but with new Russian sources never seen before in the West. If you are new to the Battle of Stalingrad, this is an excellent single source. Mr. MacGregor, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I just recently finished your book. The emotions are still reeling. I feel claustrophobic, afraid, and excited all at the same time. I don't know if that's a standard reaction to your book, but we'll get into it. But again, it was just an amazing story, and it was well told. Thank you for that.
Great.
So let's jump into this. So I've seen pictures of you in Russia. It was 18 degrees below zero, but you were smiling. I guess maybe you were just so numb you couldn't tell at that point. But I was wondering if your travels to Russia inspired this book, or did the idea for this come from something else?
Well, originally, I've always, as a kid, I think the first time I heard the word Stalingrad and knew what the battle was, I was 9 years old reading an illustrated history book for school children. Right. And that fascinated me. But then I was very lucky, fast forwarding to when I was a teenager back in the early 80s, I was very lucky that I had a progressive, forward-thinking father and mum, but it was mainly my dad. Mm-hmm. He sent me, I did camping trips to East Germany in the late 70s. And then in the early 80s, I did a student trip to the Baltic, but Russia. And I ended up in Leningrad. And that was when I was 13. And that was amazing. That was an eye-opener. That was 1981. Mm-hmm. And it was incredible. And it was still quite, I would say, it seemed like late 1940s. People were dressed that way to a large degree. There was lots of diesel cars and trucks, a lot of American-made trucks, by the way, from Lend-Lease, I suppose, a fallout from that. But then, and that just gave me a love of Central and East European history, and that's what I studied through high school, through university. My degree was in history. My dissertation was on the Prague Spring in the 1960s in Czechoslovakia. And then I've been lucky all my years as a publisher. For the last 30 years, I've published a lot of books on Europe, commercial books for normal reading that you would buy in bookshops. Mm-hmm. And then obviously the Great Patriotic War. So those photos you saw of me in Russia, that was roughly about 2 years ago. Now it was late November, early December, and it was like minus 18. But if you've studied the Battle of Stalingrad and you've studied Russia and Eastern Europe during what's called the Great Patriotic War, so the war from 22nd of June 41 right through to the end of the Second World War and Hitler's defeat, to go there and to go to these cities that you've read about constantly over the years, as a historian, it's you're a very, very happy person.
I completely understand that. I've dragged my family to several Civil War sites here in the States, and it's amazing to just stand there where incredible things happened, bravery and whatnot. And my family just kind of looks at me and they're like, "Why are you smiling?" And I'm like, I can't explain that. So, but it's great to be able to traverse the same grounds as these people who did amazing things.
Oh yeah. I mean, I love I've got a real passion for the American Civil War as well. And I've been to a few sites like Antietam. It's just incredible.
Yes. So if I could, for my next question, this is going to sound very obvious, but what is the lighthouse in the title of your book?
Yeah, it sounds mysterious, but it was a code name. So the one of the if basically to give your readers an idea, obviously to Russians and Russians today, which is what I talk about in the book, and throughout the Cold War preceding that, their victory, their sacrifice and victory in the Great Patriotic War, and I don't just mean Russians, I mean all the ethnic groups from all the 15 or 16 republics that fought within the Red Army during the Second World War, their victory still resonates today, as I'm sure it does, what the American Army or armed forces did in the Pacific and European theatres in the Second World War, and to what British forces did in Europe and elsewhere. I mean, everyone's got their own touchstones. Right. So it's huge. It's huge for them. It's almost what their modern day society is built on. And someone like Putin's come along and he's really stoking it for all it's worth. But within that, the umbrella of that, one of the biggest pillars that supports all of that is their victory. Their first proper victory over the Nazi war machine was at Stalingrad. And then within the Battle of Stalingrad itself, there's lots of heroic battles, because as I say in the book, it's the biggest military battle in history. Millions of combatants, millions of hundreds of thousands, I should say, of dead. Right. But within that is this one house. Its code name was the Lighthouse, but to Russians, and a lot of historians and people who are really into the Battle of Stalingrad and read about it, it's called Pavlov's house. And so it's this typical house represents the sacrifice and heroism of this famous fighting that's renowned for Stalingrad, of fighting house by house, brutal urban combat, floor by floor, room by room, cellar by cellar. That's what's typical of when we think of the Battle of Stalingrad and the vicious hand-to-hand fighting that was there. Pavlov's house is one of the famous buildings that, if you're Russian, you taught this at school. It's almost like the Magnificent Seven. It's this band of heroic, almost in a lot of forms, illiterate Russian peasants. A platoon of them held this massive house, 4-story house, and it was called the Lighthouse because if you stood on the top of the house, what was left of it anyway, it gave an amazing 360-degree view of the battlefield, 5 kilometers in any direction. So both sides wanted it, and it was in the middle of no man's land. And they held out for 58 days against the might of a whole German division that was determined to recapture it. So it's, like I said, it's very much like a cross between this Magnificent Seven and the Alamo to your readers. And it really is. And so a big part of my book is saying, well, I've gone to all the records in the city of Stalingrad, now called Volgograd, and I've read lots of testimonies, hundreds of them. And it is actually a huge embellishment on what actually happened, to the point of where it's almost it's propaganda.
Right. It becomes a myth in the fog. Yeah. So I'm going to try, because I loved the book, and we'll get into the details, and I'm going to try very hard not to ruin it for the readers, but you go into detail about the science of urban warfare. As you know, the Germans were doing amazing things the previous year, but that was out in the open. This is a city. The Russians have got to develop some kind of science of urban warfare, and they do, and it gets developed here. But you also, and I won't ruin that for the readers. I really want them to capture the learning curve, if you will. But I did find interesting the different nationalities that, again, you go into that into detail. And I wanted to ask, was having all these different nationalities help defend Stalingrad? Because that's a great propaganda tool. How would you not want to use that? But was that planned, or was it more just there was so many people, so many soldiers pulled to this region because Stalingrad could not fall, that they just happened to be made up of many different nationalities?
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't a plan in place that they were going to have ethnic representation of most of the republics within the battle. But when you've got millions of troops, and it wasn't just a fight for the city, it's called the Stalingrad Front. It was hundreds of kilometers long. You got vast armies, armored and infantry groups, and obviously hundreds and hundreds of aircraft on both sides, but primarily the Germans did dominate the skies over the city. for
Right.
3 or 4 months of the 5-month-long battle. But yeah, what it was we're deep inside southern Russia.
Mm-hmm.
In the whole summer offensive, which was called Case Blau, which had started late June 42, had caught Stalin off guard, or off balance, I should say, and his planners. They were fully expecting that Hitler's forces would try and replicate what they tried the year before with Operation Barbarossa, where they were going to plow straight through the center of the European side of Russia and obviously capture the capital, Moscow, which was the communication center. And they thought that would be a good blow, as Napoleon had done it. It might knock out the country, but obviously it was proving hugely difficult. And that's a different book. But Hitler had massively underappreciated how hard the Russians or the Soviets would fight, and the manpower pool that they were able to call upon, even though within the year one he'd taken over 6 million Soviet troops out of the equation off the battlefield, 3.1 million killed, 3 million captured. And he's thinking that the rotten edifice is ready to fall. But to get back to your question, with the summer offensive catching Stalin off guard going south, there were units that were eventually tracking, because a huge armies was protecting Moscow. They were, in part, some of them in echelon coming down to meet this new German threat that was going to potentially split the country in two and capture the oil fields in the Caucasus. Right. So what they were doing was to shore up the defense in the south that would ultimately lead to the big city on the Volga, which was Stalingrad. They were grabbing troops in the local area. And so a lot of those troops were obviously local to that area, to southern Russia. So that's where you've got these ethnic groups like Chechens, Tatars, Tajiks. They were there anyway because that's where they were from, and they were from locally raised regiments and divisions that were there. But then other regiments and divisions that were coming down that would obviously be going into the meat grinder that would be Stalingrad during this bitter battle. Yeah, they came from everywhere. So you've got the Siberian divisions, all that kind of, famously you've got those guys there as well. So yeah, it was a melting pot of ethnic groups that were on the one side with the Red Army, but on the other side with the German Sixth Army, you've got a whole hodgepodge of groups there as well. You've got some Croatian, you've got a Croatian regiment there. You've got Hungarians, some Italians, but I mean, these guys were out on the flanks, but some of them were in the city towards the end. Obviously Romanians. So yeah, it was a battle of nations.
Right. Well, for an area or territory this big, you would need the resources of several nations just to make it happen. I'm glad you brought up the oil, because in the book you do a great job of explaining kind of Hitler's thinking. Like Pearl Harbor comes along, the Americans are now in the war, and so this isn't just a military conflict. This is an industrial-based military conflict. Hitler knows he's going to need oil, and he needs to deprive it of his enemy, Stalin. And so I guess the idea is to go down to the Caucasus, take the oil there, start to ship it back to Germany, but at the same time, deny it to Stalin. But at first, in order to secure that route, they have to secure Stalingrad. It's on the river there. And so the setup is brilliant. It makes sense, but Hitler is very, very far away, and his generals can see a more detailed, nuanced picture because they're having to fight and lose a lot of men just to keep moving forward. So let's get this battle going. So we've all been, those of us who are into World War II, we've all, experienced or read part of Mein Kampf. We know that Hitler hates the Slavic race. He hates the Jews. He hates communism. And he's going to come personally to hate Stalin. But I wanted to ask, so setting this up, what is Hitler's larger goal with Operation Barbarossa? And what specifically is he trying to accomplish by taking Stalingrad, I guess, besides the fact that it's named after the Soviet leader?
Well, I mean, Stalingrad, I'll track back, but the bigger picture, as you just said, was the whole point of this new summer offensive, which wasn't on the same scale as the year before because he didn't have the men or machinery or materiel. They'd lost over 1 million men in the line, a vast majority of whom had been invalided out with frostbite from the Russian winter that year, which had caught them by surprise, obviously, which a lot of your listeners will know. But this move was, as you said, by that Christmas, or as we're getting into the new year of 1942, Hitler's joined Imperial Japan, his ally, and declared war on the United States. So instead of just a continental European war that he's involved in, he's got the United Kingdom, Britain, bottled up on its island.
Right.
He's in control of continental Europe. And he's made the mistake of obviously invading Russia, thinking he could knock it out in 7 or 8 weeks in the summer of 41. That hasn't worked. But this is a kind of, he's basically got to make sure, as you just said, he's got the means and the materiel to feed his war machine. He still hasn't yet got Nazi Germany on the kind of war economy that Stalin would do instantly, or within weeks of the war starting in Russia. He instantly got, the whole country was geared to war. Everything else was put aside. Didn't care about human rights or social mobility, or whether you've got enough food to eat. You don't have to queue for ration, all that kind of stuff. Germany still had a bit of that. They weren't on that total war footing, but he knew he needed oil, or as you said as well, is to deny the Soviets their own oil in the Caucasus. I mean, it was a hugely, hugely ambitious, overly ambitious plan to think that with less men than he had for Barbarossa, not knowing exactly, I mean, this is the thing, as what I say in the book, not knowing exactly how many of the enemy he still had to face. He had no idea about the millions that were coming to the call-ups and being mobilized. I mean, the Russians would go through, I mean, they'd rebuild their army 5 times throughout the whole war.
Wow.
I mean, they were suffering huge casualties, but they still had the manpower pool. And Hitler just didn't believe this could be happening.
Right.
Hugely ambitious. I would argue, and a lot of his generals would argue, and he fired most of them that did argue this, that they just didn't have the men or the materiel to take such a huge tranche of land as the Caucasus, well over 1,500 kilometers long, probably 2,000 by the time you get to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And also, he didn't have the technical teams or the technical ability in terms of transportation. Even when he seized the oil, the Russians would probably blow, and they did. They would blow up a lot of the oil bases. He didn't have the teams that could actually turn this around and fix it quickly to then transport the oil back to where it needed to go. So again, there was a lot of amazing plans to think this is what we're going to do as a battering ram to get into the country and seize the oil fields. But there hadn't been much thought about, right, this is how we're going to actually transport it and then defend it against any sudden Russian counterattacks.
Right. Now, you make an excellent point. I don't have the stats in front of me from your book, but even though Hitler was not able to achieve all that he wanted, what he was able to deny Stalin. I mean, you mentioned the tons of grain, the percentage of grain, the percentage of oil, and other things. I mean, he did, you could almost say, tie one of Stalin's hands behind his back, but there were just so many men to call on. I mean, and there's a famous, I don't have it in front of me either, and I apologize. There's a famous line where Hitler says, if I had known how many people or reserves he could have called on, I never would have, but the arrogance, National Socialist is better than any other form of government. Therefore, we cannot fail because we produce better people, better warriors than everyone else.
Yeah, I mean, that was the thing. Hitler refused to believe that he refused to believe in the fighting ability of the Red Army itself. And I suppose the victories that they'd had in the first summer were to a degree repeated, not in the size of prisoners that they would catch when the offensive started in 42, but they did fall back against the German typical tactics, combined arms blitzkrieg. It did succeed, and because they didn't have the strength of numbers in defense, because they'd spread across the whole frontier, protecting from Leningrad all the way down to Moscow, all the way down to the Caucasus. They had to protect that frontier. Stalin was expecting the main push to be at the center, and that's where the bulk of the troops were. He still thought he had enough in the south to protect against anything else, but he just didn't realize that Hitler would be rolling the dice and stripping some of Army Group North and Center to go into Army Group South to then give him superiority in arms. And that's what happened. But because he's pushing the Russians back, it reinforces his belief that, no, they can't be clever enough to have cottoned on to the fact that they shouldn't stand and fight and they should retreat in good order to save themselves. Right. And because his commanders aren't reporting that they're capturing these huge numbers of troops they had the year before, he thinks, well, they haven't got an army. That's why.
Yeah, they're taking it.
That's why he makes the hubristic mistake in late July of where he splits Army Group South in two, and he wants to capture everything in one go. So Army Group A will continue the big push instead of being en masse. Army Group South pushing down to the south once they've secured the Volga. He'll split the army. Half of it will go into the south to capture the oil fields, and the other half, Army Group B, which comprises obviously 6th Army, that's going to push to the Volga because as you said at the beginning, one of the plans was Stalingrad was never a key target as it would be by that September. At the beginning of the offensive, it was strategically important to either besiege the city, as they had like Leningrad in the north, but it was mainly to stop river traffic along the Volga, which is very much, as you said, like it's like the Mississippi. It's an arterial waterway. It was a key supply route for the Soviets themselves coming down from the north, but a lot of lend-lease coming from the Allies was going up from the Volga as well. So the Germans knew they had to stop that and they had to block river traffic. But it also protected their eastern flank while the bulk of the army should have gone south to then capture the oil fields. But that's where they got drawn into this huge battle for the city.
That's one of the, when you were talking, I just realized that was one of the great ironies of the war, is that the very giant expanse that Stalin is trying to protect at the beginning of Operation Barbarossa is hurting him because you can't protect all that much territory. Conversely, once the Axis forces start driving in, the area is just too big. You don't have enough men, so it hurts Stalin at first.
Yeah.
Then it hurts Hitler later, and of course that's what matters is how it ends. But if I could real quick, I'm sorry. I'm looking at a map. I'm looking at the maps in your book, and I'm like, there's no way. I mean, I'm not in the military. I'm not a fighter, but the distance is too vast. The roads and the rail are not conducive for what the Germans need, and they need tons of supplies every day. How is this possibly going to work?
Well, that's where the Luftwaffe came in, because that's the one thing that Army Group South and the whole offensive had in its favor was aerial superiority. And so again, like they had with their infantry and motorized units, where they'd stripped some of them from Army Group North and Army Group Centre, and they'd gone down to Army Group South for this new offensive, they did exactly the same with the Luftwaffe. So they had a very, very strong arm of ground attack, bombers, and obviously dive bombers, Stukas, and fighters. And it would be them that would lead the way or pave the way for the offensive to begin. And then over the coming weeks of that summer, they basically did shoot the Soviet Air Force in southern Russia out of the sky. And that's why they were able to dominate not only the Battle of Stalingrad for the first couple of months before winter really set in above the city, but that's what it was a Luftwaffe that kept the motorized units running, because as you said, logistically, southern Russia was quite backward in terms of not many railway lines that could connect Army Group South's units as it was spread out throughout the Caucasus over hundreds and hundreds of kilometers north, south, east, and west. So it would be aircraft that would be landing on just made or just laid improvised airfields that would be bringing the fuel for the tanks and the armored units to carry on with their thrust. But the whole of that summer, the underpinning weakness of the whole offensive was its lack of fuel.
Right.
And so it lost precious days and weeks in terms of units just sitting, waiting to be restocked with this precious fuel that would allow them to keep the momentum up. And that's what ground them to a halt. And that did allow time for Red Army units to then escape into the vastness of the Russian steppe behind them.
Right. I have to tell you this. This is try not to laugh at me too much, but when I'm about to do an interview, if it's available, I like to get the audio book as well. I walk the dog, I listen to the book. One time I'm sitting on the porch, I'm smoking a cigar, and I'm listening to your book, and I literally scream out, "Where's the Russian Air Force? Oh my God, you're killing," whatever. And I start like my screaming is going to change anything. My wife happens to be walking by, and she's just like, "What is wrong with you? Stay calm." This happened 80 or whatever years ago. But when I got to that part of your book, I think you mentioned the figure 1,000 planes that the Germans had. And then I think the Soviets at some point early on, before they were shot out of the sky, had 400 planes. I mean, you're right. That was the Germans' ace. It's going to serve them well. But as we're going to see, it's not enough. You can dominate the air all you want, but it's boots on the ground at the end of the day that make the difference.
Well, and also you got to remember that the Russian, or the Soviet, I should say Soviet, because obviously it's right. It's many ethnic groups within the armed forces.
Good point.
But you've got to remember the casualties they suffered in pilots in the first year of the war, through Barbarossa, through the Soviet counterattack that winter. They'd lost hundreds and hundreds of veteran pilots. I mean, the Western Soviet Air Force had been destroyed on the ground at the start of Barbarossa, and then the new units coming through tried their best, but they're overwhelmed. And the same was basically, history was repeating itself in the summer of '42, where you've got newly trained pilots and Soviet formations trying to take on these veteran Luftwaffe units and just coming unstuck and getting shot down. And that's what happened. And to the point where, again, because they were so outgunned, in some cases they would suicidally just ram German formations in the sky if they could get close enough.
Oh, the bravery. I lost count of the number of sacrifices on both sides, but certainly the Soviets. I lost count, just as long as I can take one of them with me, I've done my duty. So, and you and I can appreciate how long it truly takes to train someone to be ready for not just to fly a plane, but actual combat. That's a whole nother level. Yeah. There's just only so many hours. And so, that makes sense why the Germans were able to dominate the air. And it did serve them well early on in the war. So we've got General Paulus, we've got the 6th Army. They're heading towards Stalingrad because that's his latest assignment that he's been given. But we're starting to see a pattern here. We already know that up north in Leningrad, even though things are horrible, Leningrad is holding out. Even though things were pretty dicey in the first winter of Barbarossa, Moscow is holding out. And now it's going to be Stalingrad's chance to be able to prove their worth. So could you give us a description of what Stalingrad was like as the Wehrmacht is coming in to take it over?
Yeah, but it's coming in from multiple directions.
Thank you, yes.
From the north, from the center, and then from the south as well. It comes from the south. That's 4th Panzer Army, basically because the offensive in the Caucasus is grinding to a slow, almost embarrassing halt, primarily because of Russian resistance. They're putting up a good fight. But as you said, it's the length of the line of resistance as well. You're talking hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. This army, German army, spread across trying to conquer this territory, and the fuel issues that we talked about. So because he knows he's not going to take the main objectives of Case Blau are not going to be met. Hitler knows this by mid-August, I would say, that he thinks, well, I need to actually give me something that's tangible that I have to show the German people that makes up for these losses we've suffered, because they'd suffered. Right. The Soviets had put up a hard fight, and the Army Group South were taking a lot of casualties. So he has to have something. So that's why he went for Stalingrad. He said, okay, we're going to stop river traffic on the Volga, and we are actually going to take Stalin's city. Now, Stalin's city had actually been named Tsaritsyn. In the Tsar's times, imperial Tsar's times, I should say. It'd been there since the Middle Ages. It was one of those places, the Volga runs for well over 2,000 kilometers. And along its length, there are obviously lots of villages and towns that would grow into bigger towns or cities. Because obviously from a transportational hub, that's what they're there for. That's where the people go there to work and obviously to make a living and what have you. So it's a bit like the American Midwest, maybe like a Chicago. It sprouts from nothing within 100 years. It's enormous. And that's what Stalingrad was. So it went from being a kind of backwater transportation hub, mainly made up of wooden shacks with the odd stone building that would be the civic buildings and the church and everything, that probably had a population of 5 to 10, then 20, then 25, 30,000. By the end of the Russian Civil War, probably had a population of about 60 to 70,000. And Stalin himself had protected the city during the Russian Civil War. So by the time he took power in the 20s, some clever local communist official who's running the city thinks, I know, let's name it after our beloved leader. And that was in his good books. I mean,
good move. Yeah.
It's flippant, but the basics of it is true. So it was called Stalingrad. But from the late 20s all the way through the 30s, it was earmarked by Stalin that it would be the first of well over several, if not a dozen, cities that would be show cities, Soviets, how a Soviet city could look if it had the right wealth and the population, the workforce came in. And obviously it's on the banks of the Volga. So by the time the Germans got there, they're looking at a city that's at least 25 kilometers long. It wasn't a typical city in terms of, a lot of cities are just this big urban sprawled mass in a big kind of almost a circular thing like London is, but obviously split by a river. With Stalingrad, it was on the western bank primarily. And it stretched along that 25 kilometers like a ribbon along the Volga. And obviously at lots of points there's landing areas, jetties, etc., warehouses. And it was famously split into you could kind of carve it up into three sections. In the south there was the original Tsaritsyn, and that was still there, and that was mainly, as I was saying, it's wooden built houses, mainly no more than 2 or 3 stories high, cobbled streets, and that's where a lot of the agricultural workforce lived, because they're surrounded by hundreds and hundreds of miles of Soviet farmland, the steppe. And then in the center of the city, you've got what we all see in photographs. You've got the brand new city that was built in the late 20s and 30s. And that's the one it's got lots of boulevards, tree-lined boulevards, nice parks, it's got department stores, but it's got these lovely new apartment blocks that they were building for the workforce. And if you were lucky and you were right in the center, you would have one of the really, really lovely girder reinforced concrete apartment blocks that had cold and hot running water, mainline gas and electricity. So you had to be one of the party elite or one of the technicians that were working in the third part of the city, which is in the north, which would become famous as the factory district. That was the area that had 3 huge factories, I mean, monumentally big factories that had been funded and built by American and French money in the 30s. And they were building farming equipment. And it was this farming equipment that, yes, they might export some of it abroad, but primarily it was going to be used by the workforce in Soviet territory to bring on this economic agricultural explosion. But the war came along, and so like a lot of other countries, USA, UK, and Germany, obviously, they turned these agricultural factories and plants to be retooled to make armaments. So the Germans are looking at a factory district that's turning out tanks, armored boats, armored planes. And it's got a steel works, it's got a chemical works, and that would be where some of the really fiercest fighting was towards the last 2.5 months of the battle. So they're looking at this, and because it's so elongated and long, Paul is looking at it and thinking, well, I've had a really tough 7 weeks battling my way to get to this place by the Volga. If it hadn't been for my aerial superiority battering a path through for my infantry and armored units, I wouldn't even be here, because the Soviets are putting up a suicidal defense step by step. So he'd lost a lot of men. So he's thinking, can I capture this size of city and not only capture it, but hold it? And that's what he was expected to do. And he was on a timetable. Hitler had said to him, shouldn't take more than 2 weeks to capture this city. Get it done. So he wasn't going to... doing my research, I wouldn't have him down as an ardent Nazi at all, but he was a stickler for schedules. He was a stickler for orders, and he'd been brought up in that typical Prussian militaristic way of being an officer all the way back from the First World War. And he was going to follow the plan through. So he knew he had to deliver, even though he had severe doubts that he could deliver it.
Yeah, I would imagine if that had happened today, he could just whip out his iPhone, do a panoramic view and go, excuse me, sir, there's just no. I can maybe take it, holding it. That's a whole other conversation. So I'm going to ask you to describe some of the more memorable parts of the Battle of Stalingrad, introduce some of the main people on both sides. But I came up with an idea last night, and this is probably not original, but this is the impression that I got after reading your book. Let me see if I can do this now, because it's off the top of my head. The Battle of Stalingrad was to the Eastern Front what the Eastern Front was to the war in Europe. Mm-hmm. It's going to dictate, it's going to send out ripple effects, it's going to affect pretty much the whole theater. I mean, and I'm guessing that both sides maybe sense this, maybe they don't, I don't know. But again, like you were saying earlier, Hitler has no idea of the number of people that Stalin can draw upon. And what I found out in your book is that Stalin has already been hoarding men. He's hoarding divisions. He's hoarding equipment. He's just waiting for them to kind of like you were saying earlier, run low on gas or lose momentum. And then you send your massive counterattack, because Stalin made a ton of mistakes the first year by attacking too soon. The Germans were still too strong. But now to a degree, he's starting to listen to his generals, and he's got his men built up, but he's got to wait for the Germans to make the first move here.
Yeah, I mean, once they realized by, I suppose, towards the end of July, they knew this is the main German move. This is their big offensive. This is where it's coming. All the slights and the feints that we're seeing currently outside our defenses in the center of the line.
Right.
They're not going for Moscow. They're definitely going south. So as I said at the beginning, he's got to move troops down, and they're going to get there, but that will take time. So whoever's left outside the front lines that's protecting Stalingrad has just got to try and hold the line. And that's where basically it's argued, and I'd probably agree, that Paulus had his best chance of getting the city into the city quickly and taking the city. Because that first week and a half, 2 weeks of fighting, say from the 23rd of August is when the Luftwaffe stopped bombing the city. So you can say that's kind of when the battle starts. But German troops don't actually enter the city for a week after that. And but because he wanted to do it in phases, take the city within his overall plan, step by step, district by district, I think a more again, I don't mean to be simplistic, but I think a more dynamic frontline combat commander, someone like Rommel, for instance, or Manstein, who would obviously try and rescue them at the end of the battle.
Right.
They would have had the nous and the energy to make up their plan on the hoof and not follow slavishly what Hitler had requested them to do.
Right.
Because the defenses were really poor at that time. And some of the main battles that you see right at the beginning, they are the most important ones, because it slowed the momentum of the Germans getting into the city, gave the defenders time to get more reinforcements in, and that saved the situation by the middle of September, definitely, and resulted in the fact that the Germans weren't going to take the city that quickly, and therefore they were going to be in this slugfest for the next few months. But yeah, the famous parts are the very first, I suppose, sign that the Germans knew they were in for a real struggle was in the south of the city, where 4th Panzer Army were coming up, and some of their infantry units were trying to take some of the big buildings that were in the southern part of the city. And the biggest one was the grain elevator, which is huge modern building built at the time in the 1930s. And only roughly a company of Red Army soldiers held the grain building, and they held it for nearly a week. And it was vicious fighting. It took the best parts of, I think the Germans lost at least a couple of battalions in men, just trying to take this grain elevator from a company of Russians or Soviets who in the main died. I think 3 or 4 of them survived. But that gave them a clue of wow, this is a different type of fighting, and they are really putting up a serious fight, room by room, floor by floor for this building, and that's what would lead throughout the rest. And then the next big Russian, I suppose, Soviet counter-attack was, but as I talk about it in the book, by the time the Germans did invest themselves into the central part of the city, where I was talking to you about all these lovely boulevards and parks and the main train station and the department stores, and that they pushed the Russians back, or they thought they had, to the river, and some of the frontline German units were in the main ruined buildings now, looking over the Volga. And they're thinking to themselves, well, this is almost it. We've been told throughout this whole summer, we get to the Volga, we've broken the back of the Soviet army, we might actually win this thing. And that's where you get one of the first sizable reinforcements that are coming on echelon down from the north, that get to the eastern part of the Volga and are instantly ordered to get back into the city to take the city back from the Germans. And that's famously the 13th Guards Rifle Division, led by Major General Alexander Radimtsev, hugely famous in the Soviet Union, huge figure. He's like, I suppose, the equivalent of George Patton to Americans, or Montgomery is to the UK, in terms of he's just a very successful combat commander. He might be a lot junior to someone like Patton or Montgomery, but he shows that same kind of tenacity and willingness to be energetic. And he takes his 10,000 men across in this suicidal assault across the Volga, very much like the opening scene from Saving Private Ryan, where they're landing on Omaha Beach. And they incur a lot of losses, but he did retake the city, and I spent a whole chapter discussing that, what they did and the casualties they suffered. And he took 10,000 men across on 14th September, and by the end of the battle, there was less than 220 of the original 10,000.
Oh my goodness!
But that's a metaphor. Yes. That's a metaphor for Stalingrad. That's not just his division. There were dozens of divisions similar. The average life expectancy of a Red Army soldier going into Stalingrad was less than for 24 hours.
Right. I just have to say real quick to the listeners, we're doing obviously a very high level here, but you go day by day, hour by hour, and in some cases minute by minute, because you have some sources that you were able to access. But just the sheer number of of Soviet soldiers that fell defending either a building or just a corner or just a street or whatever. But the thing that happens that I found so amazing was at some point, Hitler says, not one step back. Stalin says, not one step back. Or I guess Hitler says, do not retreat. That's pretty freaking brutal. I mean, you're basically signing these guys death warrants. But at the end of the day, Stalin can, and this sounds cruel, Stalin can afford those deaths and keep fighting. Paulus cannot, but he's expected to by Führer, who is way, way far in the back, quite safe in his bunker.
Yeah, I mean, basically, the one you're referring to with Stalin, that had come before the Germans ever got to Stalingrad, but that was during these retreat that they were doing in front of the German juggernaut for the beginning of the offensive. And that was the 8th of July. That was Order 227, which is in itself is famous. And that's Stalin saying not one step back. It was primarily aimed at the officer corps because he wanted strong leaders. And it would be mainly officers that would be going into the officers and senior NCOs that didn't deliver their duty. In the main, they weren't executed. They were sent to penal battalions, and that's where you got the famous penal battalions came from around this period as well.
Right.
But you're right. With Hitler, it was all or nothing. They had to take the city. He's obviously in his headquarters. He was in Vinnytsia in Ukraine. That's where he was directing events. Paulus, and until the very end, Paulus was never really in amongst it as a frontline combat commander. He was generally at least 30 kilometers behind the front lines, directing operations. He trusted his leaders, and the Germans had a very, very good combat command structure. He trusted his divisional commanders to get the job done, and then that goes down to regimental commanders. But you're right. I mean, my book is mainly, I do give the overall strategic picture, but my book is very, very much about the personal, and that lots of research, new research, testimonies from both sides, because that's what that's what I thought is missing from all those books that you could buy about the Stalingrad battle. What I wanted to do was, one of the key battles was this fight for the center of the city, which is where we get this urban combat from, about room by room, and the storm groups on the Soviet side as well. And I wanted to think, right, I'm going to drill down. I'm going to look at just two opposing units, elite units that were there right from the beginning of the battle, that slugged it out for the next 4.5 months in the center of the city, and what life was like for them. Ordinary officers, ordinary men, just fighting and dying in that central part of the city, but giving the reader this is the overall view as we're going day by day of what's going on. So you don't lose track of the bigger picture, but you get the human story, and that was more important to me.
Absolutely. And as a writer, I just want you to know that as the story is going on, yes, you're focused here, but like we were saying earlier, the ripple effects of what's going on every day, the Soviets don't have to win. They just have to not lose. Yeah. And they keep doing that. And you start to see Hitler crack. You start to see Stalin trust more in his people and realize, okay, this is going to work. We've been building up our forces. They've run out of gas. And again, I don't want to give too much away for the readers, but massive counterattacks are launched to the north and south. There's an attempted rescue by von Manstein, who was able to capture the Crimea. So big things were expected of him. But again, at the end of the day, it comes down to two things. One, numbers, and two, and you do stress this in your book, and I really appreciated that, the Germans are there to fight, to conquer, and win, and take. The Soviets are there to fight, to defend, to live, to have children, and to carry on with their lives. Very different motivating factors during this war, during this battle.
Yeah. And I actually say it in the book, and I'm not getting political or anything like that, but
sure,
that resonates even more today with what's going on in Ukraine. It's just that the cast list has been recast. So the Russians aren't the heroic defenders anymore. They're the remorseless invaders, as the Germans were at Stalingrad. But no, you're completely right. I think in terms of what I wanted to show was the fact that it's a colossal battle. These units are being fed in and then literally just disappearing. And I just wanted, if the reader can look through my book, they will see certain characters that I begin at the beginning of the battle, and they're there right at the end of the battle, and it's what they experience on both sides. And I thought, yes, I talk about lots of casualties and horrific incidents with loss of life, but it's good to capture, because obviously they're the ones that survived that are telling the story, and that's how we know what happened. And I wanted to capture what they did as well, from top to bottom, as in from commanders all the way down to grunts on the ground.
Right.
And that's where Pavlov's house comes in too, because that's what I looked at all the testimonies of guys that were in Pavlov's house that tell the true story rather than the myth or the trope or whatever you want to call it.
Right. So I'm going to, first of all, thank you very much. This book was amazing. The emotional roller coaster, the details, the fighting. And I'm going to let you have the last word, but I do want to, I think the thing that impressed me the most was, here's World War II. It's massive. Here's the Eastern Front. It's massive. I get all that, but I truly did not have a sense of scale until I read your book. I mean, again, 1,000 planes for the German, millions of Soviet troops being massed behind and to the sides of Stalingrad. Right. I mean, the scale alone almost makes it.
I was going to say, the statistics of the battle are you look at them and you just rub your eyes, because I mean, you've got, I mean, a city that normally had roughly 450,000 civilians made up the city itself.
Right.
That had almost doubled by the time the Germans arrived because of refugees fleeing from their advance. So you got well over 800,000. By the end of the battle, I think a lot of them did get evacuated. I mean, famously, people talk about Stalin said, we're going to fight for a live city. There's going to be no evacuation. But obviously, they did evacuate people as the battle progressed.
Right.
But 64,000 civilians died. And by the time of the Soviet victory at the end of January 1943, there was 9,700 plus people were living in the city that crawled out of the sewers or holes they dug in the embankment. Many of them had been surviving eating clay in the river. The city itself, I mean, 90 is something insane. Over 90% of the city was destroyed. The Germans dropped 2.9 million artillery and bombs from the air on the city itself. There was 12% of civic housing left. 850,000 square meters destroyed in the factory district. I mean, it's just, I mean, you know, so that's why you can still see some of the ruins in the city. They've left them there on purpose, but they laid wait. And again, that's a metaphor for the European side of the Soviet Union itself. I mean, over 78,000 towns, cities, and villages destroyed during the Second World War. I mean, it's just we in the West can't comprehend that kind of level of destruction.
Yeah, and you say this in your book. Compare the casualties of this one battle compared to what the Americans and the British lost. I mean, there's just no comparison. The Soviets bled for their victory, and they deserve to be remembered. And I think that's a part of what your book is trying to do is like, yeah, we have D-Day, we have, we got things like Dunkirk and Pearl Harbor and whatnot, but the Soviets also have their moments where they made a difference.
The USA lost about 420,000 killed.
Yes.
The UK is about 450,000. But I mean, if you look at, again, I'm only picking it because it's relevant. Look at many ethnic groups fought in the Red Army. Ukrainians had about 5 million fights throughout the war in the Red Army, and 1.6 million of them died. And that's more than America, the United Kingdom, and France combined. And that's just Ukraine. You could pluck out several ethnic groups, and obviously the Russian total is massive. I mean, it's well over 10 million. 34 million Russians answered, 34 million Soviets answered the call during the Second World War. And like I said at the top of the program, their losses were so huge during the war, they rebuilt the Red Army 5 times.
That's
because of the
staggering.
It's staggering. Exactly. You just can't comprehend that kind of suffering. And that's why really when you go to the country, I mean, a lot of us won't be going there for the foreseeable future because of what's going on. But when you go there, and if any of your listeners went to Volgograd, you see these huge statues that dominate the landscape everywhere you go. Some of them are like 50 foot high. And famously, the Motherland Calls, which is the top of the big hill in Volgograd, the Mamayev Kurgan, that's taller than the Statue of Liberty. But they're there for a purpose, and it's to almost dominate your thinking that something colossal happened here.
Yes.
And you can't escape it.
Right. And it changed the outcome of the war overall. So
it's what I do a lot of talks in colleges and schools here, and what I try and say to them is you have to remember all eyes of the world were on Stalingrad at the time, because that's where everyone thought, and what they were being told by newspapers and radio broadcasts you could be in Cape Town in South Africa, Delhi in India, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, London, wherever. Everyone, day by day, were focusing on Hitler's huge gamble in the South and then to try and take Stalingrad. And that's why it resonates in the West so much as well, because we've been brought up with it through just looking through the history books of what happened at the time.
Right. Yeah, never underestimate a desperate people who are determined to live and survive. The human spirit, it continues to shock me in a good way, and it's very inspiring. Mr. MacGregor, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for this book. Trust me, readers, you will not be disappointed. The Lighthouse of Stalingrad, The Hidden Truth at the Heart of the Greatest Battle of World War II, and your other book, Checkpoint Charlie, The Cold War, The Berlin Wall, and the Most Dangerous Place on Earth. Mr. MacGregor, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks very much, and wishing all the listeners a happy Christmas.
Hello, and thank you for listening to the History of World War II podcast, episode 397, Prelude to the First Battle of El Alamein. When the news of the fall of Tobruk was given to Churchill, it came from President Roosevelt himself, as the Prime Minister was in Washington, so the two leaders could discuss how best to use American troops who were coming online in significant numbers. And like with Hong Kong and Singapore, Churchill was left bereft of energy upon hearing the news. What made him feel better, as he would later write, was FDR offering kindness in this moment. Quote, "There were no reproaches, not an unkind word was spoken. What can we do to help?" queried the president. Actually, a lot. As the summer of 1942 went on, Rommel was getting closer to the Suez. General von Paulus of the Sixth Army was getting ever closer to Stalingrad, while von Kleist was making his way towards the Caucasus oil fields. But what lifted the spirit of Churchill was when he got Roosevelt to agree with him versus the American chiefs of staff. They wanted to send American boys to the UK, build up their numbers, and then, in the fall of 1942 or early 43, send them over in a cross-channel invasion, all to be called Plan Bolero. But the Prime Minister knew they, nor the Americans, not even combined, were ready for that. But how to pitch it to the wily and determined president? But not only was FDR looking to get into this war now that his resources were starting to grow, he also wanted to help the Prime Minister with his worsening situation in North Africa. So when Churchill pitched the idea, look, you've got young men training and you've got your special forces, i.e. the Rangers, looking like they're ready to go. But for both groups, the vast majority of them have not seen combat or seen the elephant, as the Rangers would say. So why test them in northern France, where they may fail and be pushed back into the sea? Besides, neither of us have near enough shipping for that, when you can send them to North Africa. They get some combat experience for themselves, while them landing at all may upset Rommel's plans, for now he will have an enemy in his rear. All to the good, yes? To which FDR agreed, much to the chagrin of his generals. This was Operation Super Gymnast and had been discussed during the Arcadia Conference, but then pushed aside for Palermo. But now it seemed that was back on the table. On August 1st, 1942, a bit ahead of our story, FDR will send to the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff a memo of his decision. It was recorded thus. The President stated very definitely that he had made the decision that Torch, the landing of U.S. troops in French North Africa, should be undertaken at the earliest possible date. He considered that this operation was now our principal objective, and the assembly of means to carry it out should take precedence over other operations. Indeed, even before this, there was concrete talk of sending U.S. troops and tanks to Cairo, when General Ritchie lost Benghazi earlier that year. But again, the shipping was not available. Instead, General George Marshall, in still trying to satisfy the goal of helping the Allies in North Africa, sent 300 Sherman medium tanks and 100 self-propelled guns to Egypt. And the British knew this was a serious gift, as Marshall had to take the weapons from active units who were currently training with them. Even more, Roosevelt approved the establishment of HQ U.S. Army Air Forces Middle East with 1 heavy bomber, 2 medium bomber, and 3 fighter groups. These would take time to get into place, but it bolstered the beleaguered British. Next, FDR had General Maxwell, the head of the U.S. Lend-Lease mission in Cairo, given the military status of Commander, U.S. Army Forces Middle East Theater of Operations. This allowed Maxwell to yell at more people, which also sped things up on the military base. He was also sent additional engineer and logistic units to speed up the flow of supplies going to the British and Russians via the Red Sea and Persian Gulf. All this in response to the fall of Tobruk. Back to the fighting in North Africa, the El Alamein line that Rommel had reached on June 30th honestly existed more in the collective British minds than in reality. As the South African official historians wrote, when the riflemen heard the suave voice of the BBC announcer reporting that 8th Army had reached the Alamein line, They looked around at the empty desert, indistinguishable from the miles of sand to the east and west, and commented as only riflemen can, which we will leave right there. The most recent attempt to rectify this was done by Lieutenant General Sir James Marshall Cornwall. As there was a 40-mile or 64-kilometer wide gap between the coastline and the Katara Depression, Sir James decided to build 3 strongholds. The first, in the north, was near the coast and could hold 3 infantry brigades and a corps headquarters. Given its position, it blocked the coast road and the rail line close by. The second fortification, a brigade box, was done up at Bab et Katara, or Kapanga, so nicknamed by the New Zealanders who helped build it. But truth be told, this position, some 15 miles or 24 kilometers southwest of El Alamein station along the coast, was only partially dug in. But no mines were put around it, which is odd, as Kapanga sits on the barrel track that goes from Fuka to Cairo. Lastly, to the southwest of Kapanga, by about 11 miles or 17 kilometers, was Nag Abu Duis, which sits just above the Katara Depression. Now, this was a fortified position, well, not really at all. The plans were made, a map was drawn on paper, but that's as far as this third and southernmost fort got, which was unwise, given that Rommel had, twice now, skirted around Ritchie's defensive lines. When General Norrie of 30 Corps arrived at the El Alamein area on June 26th, he set up him and his to defend the northern half of this defensive position. Overall, his area was flat and featureless, but only later would he learn to respect the few ridges and depressions around him, as they could hold men and tanks without anyone being the wiser. By now, everyone on the Allied side was guessing that when Rommel came, he would head south, cut across the desert, and then, once past El Alamein station, he would turn north and cut the coast road. All 8th Army had to do was stop him from doing this. But General Norrie was determined to stop Afrika Korps if they chose to come along or just below the coast road. So he got Major General Dan Pienaar's 1st South African Division to hold the El Alamein box, aka El Alamein Station. Specifically, the South African 3rd Brigade would hold the station itself, while 2nd and 1st Brigades were set up just below the southern perimeter of the station, should Rommel try to drive his panzers between the station and the Ruwisat Ridge, some 5 miles below it. If he did, the triangulation of South African artillery units would give him a nasty surprise. Just ahead or to the west of the Ruwisat Ridge was the Deir el-Shin Depression, and there Norrie had a fort built and manned by the 18th Indian Infantry Brigade Group from Syria. When the 4th and 22nd Armor Brigades arrived in the area, they were put in just behind or just east of the South Africans to provide defense in depth if needed. Using the Ruwisat Ridge as a west to east divider of this area, the territory below the ridge would be shielded by General Gott's 13th Corps. This area was less flat, with its escarpments, depressions, and hills, and overall, the land rose the more south one went, towards the Katara Depression. See episode cover map. The New Zealand 6th Brigade rushed up from deeper in Egypt, were sent to Kapanga, a bit ahead or in front of the El Alamein station, but to the southwest. Kapanga is also due south of Tel El Isa, where the most forward units of the 90th Light Division had been checked by Allied artillery when they first arrived. The retreating New Zealanders were to join up with the 6th, and other New Zealander units were placed just behind this position on the Deir el Munasib Depression. To help out these defenders, 7th Motor Brigade was stationed just ahead of the New Zealand units by about 5 miles west by southwest of Kapanga. But below the New Zealanders was another massive escarpment, and below it would be Rommel's last lane, should he choose to come this far south. Just above the beginning of the Qatar Depression, there were three Allied forces, from left to right, or west to east. They were the 9th Indian Brigade, the 5th Indian Division, and behind them, should all else fail, the 7th Armored Division. The only other major geographical feature not mentioned in this area is the Alam Halfa Ridge. The Ruwayzat Ridge is due south of El Alamein Station, but the Alam Halfa is about 5 miles southeast of Ruwayzat Ridge. On its far right end, but below it, sat the headquarters of 8th Army, where Auchinleck was. Just above it was the 50th Division of General Holmes' 10th Corps. The rest of the Corps was on its way east, but the 50th was told to stay and break into 3 artillery columns. Again, the idea being, should the panzers get this far, they might walk into a crossfire, one they would be unable, hopefully, to get out of. The first Battle of El Alamein actually started off with the advantage going to the Allies. As the defending armor units were making their way to this new defensive line, actually a cluster of defensive positions versus a constant line, they ended up traveling beside and at times within Axis columns. Naturally, the shooting started. But however it happened, by the time the defending tanks reached the El Alamein station, the Littorio Armored Division had lost practically all of its guns and most of its tanks. This was obviously all to the good and was unavoidable, as they were all going in the same direction at the same time and heading for the same place, more or less. But it did mean that only the 22nd Armored Brigade Group was in place for the coming battle. On a lighter note, the 4th Armored Brigade actually got bogged down in the sand at Tel El Isa, uncomfortably close to the 90th Light Division, which is where Rommel wanted his forces to meet up. Fortunately, the 4th Armored got out of there just in the nick of time. Before the shooting gets started, it's worth noting that some historians have criticized Auchinleck for not telling 8th Army, at this point, that they had reached the do-or-die stage of their duty, as in, we stand here, we will not be moved. But that would fly in the face of his desire, nay, his order, that 8th Army would become and remain a mobile defense, and that it would remain in being to remain a thorn in Rommel's side. And he was right to do so. If one needs it put more succinctly, the C&C issued the following to 8th Army on June 30th. The enemy is stretched to the limit and thinks we are a broken army. His tactics against the New Zealanders was poor in the extreme. He hopes to take Egypt by bluff. Show him where he gets off. But Auchinleck wasn't the only one wearing his heart on his sleeve for this upcoming battle. For better or worse, Rommel would decide to attack the northern half of the enemy's dispositions, that being the troops under General Norrie, and he had read them the riot act, as in, this is where we stand until either they or we are dead. Period. This was contrasted by the likes of General Dan Pinar, who was openly saying the army should line up on the far side of the Suez Canal and fight there. On the other hand, he had already told his men to fight hard, to avenge Tobruk, which sounds like, emotionally, Pinar was all over the place. And given what they had endured so far, this is not surprising. But it was General Gott that shook his men the most. Well, those within earshot. He was telling people that the entire Middle East was lost. It was just a matter of when. Then he showed certain officers a plan to evacuate Egypt, which a military should prudently do, but you don't talk about it, and you certainly don't let on to the troops, which just pissed off the New Zealanders even more. They were ready to fight and did not think much of Rommel's prowess, nor, for that matter, much of the British desire to give battle. A mixed bag, to be sure. As much as Rommel embodied the supposed advice given by Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest when he said, in terms of battle, get there firstest with the mostest, the Desert Fox would plan more here than at the Battle of Mersa Matruh. At first, the BBC gave Rommel pause when they reported on the vaunted El Alamein line, but then he was confused when his reconnaissance team reported on a concentration of troops at the El Alamein station, or Alamein box, and at Kapunga, but little else. And as Rommel, this time, was not simply going to go around the enemy, what his reconnaissance reports told him should be covered. He was told that the Indians were placed about 4 miles west of Ruwisat Ridge, but actually were only 2 miles in front of it. But at least they got right that Norrie and his were in the north, while Gott and his were in the south. Next, somehow, Rommel was told that 50th Division and not the 3rd South African Brigade was in the El Alamein box. But the most costly mistake made was when Rommel was not told of the 2 South African Brigade columns just below the Alamein box perimeter, nor that the 4th Armor Brigade was with them, creating a perfect tunnel of destruction should the Axis forces come just below El Alamein station, which is where Rommel wanted to focus his main thrust. To be sure, Rommel had thought of driving south, but he believed that was going to the well one time too many. No, after a think, he would press hard between El Alamein Station and Ruwisat Ridge in the form of the 90th Light and Africa Corps. And once they were past El Alamein, the 90th Light would turn north to cut off the coast road, and the Africa Corps would turn south to deal with the supposed 13th Corps of Gott, which was not there, as the German reconnaissance had missed this. To either side of Rommel's thrust, the 3 Italian corps would stand and make sure of no counterattack. It was only a matter of time before the enemy would fall apart and then fall back again, which is when the Italians would rush forward and help Rommel push on to Cairo. And yet, this battle would not be full of daring Axis thrusts and cowardly Allied retreats. No, Rommel's side would make mistakes. There would be delays, and the Allies would show themselves capable of going toe-to-toe with the famous Africa Corps. Postscript. The BBC's broadcasts during the last 2 days of June were certainly in the service of king and country. They told of a solid line 40 miles long between the Mediterranean and the Qattara Depression, one that had no gaps or ends for Rommel to try to run around. No, if he wanted Egypt, he would have to fight for it. The point is, their reports were so enthusiastic that Rommel put off his attack for 24 hours to get a better sense of what was before him, although, as we have seen, his reconnaissance units could have done better. As for C Auchinleck, he had fully recovered from the lackluster performance at Mersa Matruh. As he told his chief of staff, Dorman Smith, "The British pride themselves on being good losers. I am a damn bad loser. I'm going to win." Greetings, everyone, from Central Virginia. So this will not be my last episode of the year. I think I can at least do one more, as long as I can squeeze it by the wife. Anyway, just wanted to thank a couple people. I'm going to try to do a better job of keeping up on this. So as far as my latest members, or I should say member, Caleb Yeager from Star, Idaho, is now supporting the show. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the membership episodes. I think there's 209 of them now, something like that. And as far as donations, there's Michael Fisher, who, besides donating, sent me a very lovely message that made my day. So, Michael, thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank Lamel Krim, if I'm saying that right, for his donation as well. So, again, thank you. It really makes a huge difference around here, and I certainly do appreciate it. I hope you all are safe. I hope you were good, so Santa brings you everything that you want or deserve. And I'll see you again with the next episode as soon as I can. Take care, everyone.